I've got a lot to show you, so I'll go straight into this. Can the light come down a bit in the front, or is that not possible? Anyhow, coming up from air is really talking about the sort of internal architectural culture of how we watch certain people, listen to certain people, and then usually the same old names keep coming around. Some people sitting here hope to become the same old names of the next generation. It doesn't always happen. And so, you know, there are a lot of people that I know and admire and so on. They're not in it. I'm starting with what I call simple history or pesky talent. Christopher Wren obviously was a great operator, but, you know, Hawksmoor, that was the interesting guy. Or me and a whole lot of generations either side of me brought up on the Bauhaus. The Bauhaus is the easy brand of modernism. But what about funny guys like Hugo Herring? A bit kind of hanging out, a bit more original. Or even, you know, even when you go to Paris and you look at the Corbusier buildings, I'm sort of fascinated by funny guys like Mallet Stevens. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't as talented. But there are lots of things he did that were, in some ways, you know, off the edge. And certainly when we come to nearly contemporary people, you know, there are people with immense power, influence, and architectural chit-chat. But there's a real talent, sadly, I have to say, in my dead section. So this is the dead section. They're extinct, but I think still sending out waves, not to my taste, but one has to admit that Aldo Rossi is there in the background to many things that some rather good architects do. I think, to me, Rossi is not a Calvinist, but there's a sort of parallel of that kind of architecture to Calvinism, to very grim thinking. Whereas somebody like Oithe, I once took a bunch of students, and Oithe talked, he was a very old man by that time, talked for 4 hours, wouldn't let us out of the room, with immense enthusiasm. But the enthusiasm followed up by really rather more than cute detailing, I mean extraordinary detailing of both of those buildings. But what about strange people around the corner? The 90-year-old Fisak was still alive when I was taken to see him, but a sad person who'd been pushed out by the religious, whatever you'd like to call them, in Madrid. He'd been deliberately sidetracked and sat in a little house in a far-flung corner. And, of course, his best building pulled down. And Fisak was even into quilted concrete, which now has come back as a sort of fashionable conversation. Old Fisak was there way, way back. There are other people who happen to be sort of either in the wrong place at the wrong time, perhaps in the right place at the wrong time. And I still come back to Pancho Guedes, who, at an age older than I am now, spent 2 hours taking people around, finally recognized in Lisbon, around the museum there, where he had his kind of 900 artifacts up. And he did really weird shit out in what was then called Mozambique, and always doing weird shit drawings, because, I mean, that drawing on the right is a cross-section of a building. But the buildings don't disappoint either, and the plan of the hotel, bottom left, is still my favorite plan of a hotel and would have been fantastic. But there are other people, sadly, much younger, who, you know, was sort of on the edge. I mean, Catherine, I think, was always treated with distance when she lived in Tokyo. And who else would do a soft and hairy house? Returning to the UK, she did this, I think she won the competition for a country house, a brilliant project which Zaha was actually jealous of, which I suppose is some kind of accolade. Ah! What's that? It is, of course, our late lamented friend Will Alsop, who, top right, was still doing very, very original stuff right to the bitter end. I think the top right was only a year or so before he died, if I'm right. And, of course, the much lamented Enrique, who I taught alongside for some years and saw in action. What is interesting about some of his buildings, they look, well, one building did collapse, but not his fault, but they look as if they're about to collapse, and they lean, and then you look at the detail, and actually it's incredibly clever stuff, clever engineering. And he once at the Berkeley gave a 2.5-hour lecture on this building, starting off with the details and only revealing the final building at the end of the lecture. An extraordinary talent, which those of you who go to Edinburgh to see the Parliament will see, of course, helped out by his widow, Benedetta. The impact of drawing, well, there's a lot that I and my friends talk about drawing. Some people would, and my wife Yael, will sometimes argue with me that you know, if you can draw beautifully, it doesn't necessarily mean that you can design. But what is intriguing about Lev is that before he did all these drawings, he was a job architect on a very large building in New York and was trained as an engineer. And what's intriguing about his drawings is that they didn't show perfect objects. There was always patina, there was always a hint, the thread of the thing collapsing or exploding. And he reputedly drove into Sarajevo during the middle of the war in an armored car and taught for 2 weeks and then was driven out in an armored car. He was looking for trouble. And towards the end of his life, he started to actually make spatial conditions. This is a very bad photograph of an exhibition in Paris, in Cartier Center. And of course, you know, strands going across space are very fashionable right now. A funny old story. I just want to introduce something. You know, what is the hope of the architect? What is the predicament of the original architect? After all, hanging out with Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera, he did effectively a sort of almost Corbusian villas with a few extras. So he's a proper, down-the-line, modernist architect. Ha! What's that? Bloody hell. It's a library. It's actually, if you analyze the building, it is a large book stack on top of some public rooms. So it's actually pretty normal. But he started going over the top. He started doing more and more and more drawings and built himself a weird shit house. And then it got even stranger and stranger. What's going to happen to this guy? He retreats to his house, gets depressed, kills himself. I'm not suggesting this is a corollary of doing original work, but it does make you think. There's another category of people, though, which is what I call simmering. They are around. They are not dead. They are around us. My friend Zvi Hecker, when the Scuds were landing in Tel Aviv some years ago, the police phoned him up and said, something's happened to your building. In fact, nothing had happened to the building. And I always say, when I first saw this years ago, I said, it's NATO built. It's as near, particularly on this picture, it's as near as NATO built as anything you'll ever find. And then he won some competitions, moved to Berlin, it's the Berlin School, and he's actually built round the corner, except I can never seem to find it on Schiphol. He's just finished the security village at Schiphol Airport, in fact. A guy that I have enormous time for, never seems to get beyond local recognition, is Chapella. And these buildings, I think, have won competitions but not necessarily been built. There's a whole story about his winning of the Angewandte Kunst building, which I will not go further into, but it caused a stink because he won it and everybody wanted somebody else to win it. And he should have won it, and this is the scheme. But watch Chapella. Watch him. And watch funny characters who are in slightly funny places, like, you know, Albuquerque, which is not, frankly, the center of the world, and then builds in Winnipeg, which also is, quite frankly, not the center of the world. I think we become too metropolitan where you expect there to be interesting architecture. It's not... Ha! What's that? Bloody hell. Well, I know about this guy because I gave him first prize in the Shinkenchuku donkeys years ago. And this was his project for the Shinkenchuku competition, which was called Confusion. Having won the money, he then went and worked for Gunter Domenic, which caused more confusion, I think, usefully. And there he is. And I have a terrible tale to tell. I was in a bar in Tokyo with Tom Hennigan and Catherine Finley, and I'd met him a few times before. And I said, he'd built this building in Roppongi or somewhere. And I said, how are things going? He said, wife dead, building demolished, which is a bit of conversation stopper. He has since remarried and done more buildings, but he's an odd character who, you know, it's even for somebody who likes, as I keep saying, weird shit, it's a difficult to grasp vocabulary. Then there are people who are very much in full flight. No problem with those. In the Architectural Association, which I think the lady's coming this afternoon, they're all wetting their knickers over Pier Vittorio Orelli. You know, he's got acolytes, he's got people. And for me, with a slightly long memory, I think, but we did all that. We did all that. It's back to Matthias Ungers. You know, and it sort of irritates if you see something that wasn't really your bag come around again. What do you do with that intellectually? Ah! This is one, actually, that Yale discovered long before I did. And it's interesting that he himself claims to be, well, he's an ex-student of Greg Lynn. He claims to be part of the gang around Greg Lynn. But when you look at it, he's wanting to be a neoclassicist. I think there's very little doubt that he's wanting, and he did work for Bob Stern, which, of course, adds to the question. But he is nonetheless erudite and intriguing. Some of these people, you can't ignore them. You don't even want them to go away. You want them to, in a way, confuse the issue. And I think the most beautiful thing I've seen at a Biennale, I don't know whether the guy's in the room, he's somewhere, gave a beautiful lecture last week at the Bartlett. John Wardle, his object in the Arsenale, at the last Biennale of Venice, was fantastic and intriguing and elegant and tricky and cultural. And, you know, we can do it better in Australia than you can do it in bloody Europe. That's for sure. And his buildings continue to shock by their elegance and their aesthetic. Or you get nutters like Fujimori, who actually is an academic. He's actually professor of history at Tokyo University. And it was only that Ito didn't want to do a certain job, and he was a neighbor, and he gave it to Fujimori. And suddenly, Fujimori, after being considered as a historian, and if university historians here should think twice, perhaps, because he starts doing these things in the end. And in conversation with him through a translator, he does know about English arts and crafts movement. If you look at some of his stuff, you know that he knows about the English arts and crafts movement, although I wouldn't make more British claim upon him. But it's there. And God, we've got quilting again. He, I think, couldn't possibly have known Fizek. But it's a bit interesting that these guys somehow go for quilting. We'll just leave that as an uncomfortable thought. And then there's a whole stream of people in Madrid that intrigue me. Is Askin, of course, we meet often every week at the Bartlett, and she does things with bicycle wheels. She's wonderful, over-the-top person, and plants these extraordinary objects. Now, there is a man, almost secret man, called Pirea, who has taught in Madrid for many years. And all the Madrid people I'm showing now, different though they are, all studied with that guy. I'm always intrigued by things like this, something going on, even though, and Hack and Chinchilla, it's sort of unspoken, but now it's spoken. They're very much in a sort of rivalry between the two. They all came out of Perea's studio. As did this, a guy that we judged in Cyprus 2 or 3 years ago, and Elias Engelis, and I really wanted this guy to win, but the locals couldn't I mean, this project would have been extraordinary, but there is a cultural issue with sort of islands in love with their past and rather second-rate level of architecture. I'm being bitchy now, but it would have been unbelievable. And he's going to win one of them any minute, I think. Or Gil Bartolome, who was actually a Bartlett student after studying with Perea. All these guys came out of a single studio, and it's sort of beyond a joke. Or oldies. We once had at Bartlett Gaetano Pesci talking about a rubber house. And a moderately sophisticated London audience is funny about rubber houses. You don't quite know how things are going to go at the end of it. And he got away with it. The kids loved it, but you didn't know whether just rubber houses would be a bit too much for them. And, hold on, MVRDV. What's going on? I mean, it's a very obscure project. And he's kind of, can be sort of cute. I once had supper in an apartment done by one of his lovers who in New York, and it was full of Gaetano Pesce sort of basins and floors and windowsills. It's quite extraordinary. Sort of slightly hard to take somehow. But he is still an interesting architect. He's usually dismissed as a sort of chair maker or object maker. Cute. Yes, we are familiar with cute drapes, particularly if you're in architecture. And some interesting architects don't just do the drapery. I think that much as the fact that Ma Yan-song can be kind of irritating, I think he can also prove that he is very dexterous. It's not just a cloak person. He's not just a sort of press-the-button parametric person. And I find projects like this, where it starts having individual substance, really quite interesting. Ha! Isn't it funny? You do this thing, it's wonderful, and then you want to make a poke it. It's very odd, that. I mean, maybe it's some instinctive, well, it may have overtones that are more basic, but it does intrigue me. But some people, it irritates me, again, rather like Chapella. Look, they are sort of known in certain ways, but they are, somebody like Maya is, I think, very original, very talented, and very intriguing. He sets up a solid which isn't doing the things that solids usually do. And yet it has entrails in the solid, less so in the Seville building, but certainly in his concrete buildings. And I don't know why he isn't up there somehow. And even the bloody Swiss, who are not my favorite thing, there's the odd talented one who starts letting it hang out. So I don't know Mr. Zuber, but I congratulate him, he says pompously, upon letting it hang out. And you can see he wants things to hang out, but he's still a bit Swiss, so he can't quite manage that, I think one of the most impressive buildings I've ever been in, and I'm not going to show Clorindo Testa's bank again, because I use it in every second lecture. I think part of the audience probably be bored with me showing it. But how about Alberto Calac and his Mexico City library? It's an extraordinary, it is a rack, or a myriad of racks. And that's it. It's a rack that you wrap. But he's not just a one-shot pony. He's actually done a very large number of mostly houses, both in Mexico and a bit in California. And there's another, came to the Bartlett once and gave a very witty, in English, very witty lecture. Very caustic and very witty. And yet, never talked about in Europe. Never talked about in Europe. Or some people I don't know, but intriguing in another direction, sort of brooding. There's a sort of Nordic brooding scene, which can get a bit sort of pleased with itself, but I think certainly worth taking on board as needing to come up for air. Maybe they need a bit of air as well. And then you get people who are associated with one kind of architecture. You discover that actually Mr. Radic is doing constructivism somewhere out there in Chile, though his brooding work I find more intriguing. I don't think his London pavilion was him at his best. I think he's better than that. And certainly those spooky things in the trees start to at the least intrigue one. And spooky things of a different kind coming, of all places, from Canada. The Patkars are, again, known in certain circles, but much, much less than their clear talent, both not only in producing formal objects, but some of their schools are extremely unusually planned and intelligently planned. And their pieces, the pieces of the bottom left is actually an organizational model for a building. The bottom right, obviously, is an entrance. And the school, I couldn't find an interior that would communicate, but that has an extraordinary kind of spinal system running inside it, the school. And there are people who we know, and because of their success at a certain level of design, we associate that they must that's what they do. And Ron, for many years, has said, it's his chairs that have subsidized the architectural practice. But in fact, the architectural practice not only exists via things like the Holon Museum, which you could say in conceptual terms is something of a toy added to a box. But I think now he's building high-rises. They're by no means toys applied to a box. He's in there for the whole hog. And it's pretty memorable. It's not doing all the most fashionable things. It's doing something else. And then you get odd characters. I don't know this character, and I think it's a man rather than a lady, but you can do some original things in very modest circumstances. You don't need it to be in a metropolitan location. You don't need it to be expensive. And then there are the kids coming up, or rather trickling down into the idea of building and trickling down into the city I've always found intriguing. Again, then, another character who's doing these kind of spooky, kiln-like buildings, and people doing rather, in Shanghai, doing rather European facades. I found what's intriguing about this, not only I love kiosks, I like his kiosk, but if you look at that facade, it could be Netherlands or Belgium, or somewhere in Ireland. It's intriguing that is developing in China. And in Tokyo, there are kids. These are a couple who used to work for Sana, but obviously breaking free of Sana, but haven't yet done anything very big. And I think these are Chinese guys working out of LA, again, starting to break free. And these are favorites of mine. I think they've won awards here in the past. They might even be up for something this week, I don't know. And they do what they call plug-in houses. They do strange. And if you think of that, if you think of the Andre Huck house and this, there's something going on in a loop between maybe Madrid and Beijing. And they do sillies. They do almost archigram tradition sillies. You don't really need there to be 4 cyclists to move a tent, but why not? Maybe 3 of them haven't got much else to do anyhow. And then back to spookies, back to kiln-like spookies. There's something going on in the back of certain architects' mind that is it sinister? Is it religious? Is it a kind of innate wish to break out of the box and break out of the skirt and have strange courtyards, as secret places, strange things over the head, by otherwise perfectly respectable architects. A couple who were in a competition here a couple of years ago didn't win. Now they have broken through with their department store thing in Toronto. They're actually a Japanese or Japanese-Canadian couple working out of the unlikely hotbed of Toronto. And there is, meanwhile, a whole church of the parametric, and really the queen of the church, apart from having dated Brad Pitt, which is, I suppose, considered a sort of gong of some sort, is really the queen of the movement and considered to be the cleverest person in the business. And so if one goes to places like FRAC and sees what is going on of late, it has become, some of it very original, some of it very baroque, and certainly not just drapes. This is my point. That has to be watched, because the sooner that gets into the mainstream, the better. And some of Nigel's extraordinary things in previous years, you imagine it done by the guy on top right, whose name I've forgotten. So we look to the east, and we wonder. I'm definitely looking at the east. I can plot in the WAFs of recent years the number, not just the number of young people from China, to some extent Japan and district, but the degree to which they're pushing the edge. And I think in 5 years' time, all these sort of German and Anglo-Saxon and Australian judges will have to retire. It ought to be a different scene, but that may be an uncomfortable thought. And I've actually left myself 10 minutes for questions. Jeremy.
Well, Peter, that's excellent. Thank you very much. I think what you've done is to give us an insight into various trends in architecture across the world that don't conform, and by not conforming, they actually open new territories. I'm thinking of the spooky. I mean, that's a word I haven't heard too often in architectural
print. Hear it from me often.
Yeah, I might hear it from you, but I'm not sure it's one I would use, although I'd like to be able to. But I think it's taking these, if I may say, slightly sly or sideways looks into what people do and say, hey, that isn't just a big building in Tel Aviv like Ron Arad's building. It is actually doing something that's part of a way of thinking about architecture, which is testing the boundaries or living perhaps just within or just on the other side of where the boundary is of what we think architectural taste is.
Yeah, and I think it's also biographical in the sense that there's certain people like Zvi Hecker was, when I first met him when I was first with Yale, and he was almost shunned by the local Tel Avivian architects, befriended by artists, until he won a couple of competitions in quick succession. Then, of course, the museum gives him a show, and all the architects come back to his New Year party, which makes you sick, really, but it's every... and there are certain people who sort of appear to go to sleep, and then, God, they're still at it. And so poor Pancho Guedes, he was booted out of, he ran the Witwatersrand school, and then in old age came back to Portugal, and he's not what the Portuguese do. And he moved to a little house, and he started doing funny things at the entrance. And then, just before he died, had this enormous show, and everybody, so these guys, as a pattern is that they're shunned, and then the people around the world take interest in them, and suddenly they have their death row show.
Panchik was part of Team 10, wasn't he? He was associated with
fringe member of Team 10, and Alison Smithson once said, oh, he's too lazy, which I could never understand. He did 400 buildings.
Yeah.
And innumerable pieces of sculpture and so on.
And ran a large school of architecture. Yeah. So, by definition,
I'm not sure whether one can say there's a definite pattern, but it is interesting to take certain people's psychology, and certain of them, they just hang on in there until somehow it gels.
Yes.
And they tend to be people who are at the edge of the local okay scene. So they might be seen at a cocktail party, but probably not.
Yeah.
Unless sitting somewhere in an old house at the edge.
Yeah.
And then, with luck, some just then die.
Yeah.
But with luck, they re-emerge.
Yeah. No, but I think it's very interesting. If you take Portugal, where we're going to be next year, for those of you who don't know, we're going to be in Lisbon next year. And of course, you've got Angola on one side of Southern Africa and Mozambique on the other. And someone who knew about the Portuguese Empire said it was all the naughty people who went to Mozambique because it was that bit further and they had that bit more freedom. Whereas Angola, which was a richer country and, you know, that you had to be proper and, you know, wear your starched collar sort of thing.
But I have a second take on that, because the really interesting city in Portugal is Porto. Yeah. Which does everything wrong and everything naughtily. You know, it has a main street that goes down the hill in the middle of the town, stops. It has a crossing of the river which has a bridge on top of another bridge, as if they said, not quite sure which one is going to work. and hilarious architecture, which is everything sort of Belgian Art Deco through to sort of, you know, Wiltshire, all cheek by jowl. So I think there has to be something built into WAF which says, you know, if you really want to see good shit. In fact, Rem's building in Porto is perverse and extraordinary.
Yeah, and it's one of the best of his I've seen, certainly, and experience. But I think, coming back to someone else who I think is really interesting is Fujimori. And, you know, he obviously doesn't speak English. But
well, his wife teaches English.
Okay,
so that is convenient.
But you know, he's absorbed the English arts and crafts movement of all bizarre movements to absorb, and then...
No, he admits he did, I think, 2 tours of English arts and crafts.
Yeah.
And you can see even the sort of thatch detail. You know.
And there was one building he had that seemed to be floating. I don't quite know how...
Well, yes, there's a story, Al will tell the story, that he was giving us lunch up there, and I was too scared on the top of the ladder that I only stuck my head in the hole and quickly descended. But he's done a number of these houses in his original village. There's a little museum and one of his houses on sticks. Otherwise, it's just a perfectly normal village in a valley somewhere. And his own house, I have to report that the twigs haven't really grown, so that you have to see early photographs of it, which suggests that trees are growing out of the roof. Because when we saw it, they were sort of wilting. They're probably not even there now. But having I mean, that's a typical sort of downer report. I think he's extraordinary and extraordinarily sophisticated. I mean, it's very knowing stuff.
Well, you're absolutely right. The way the thatch on that house
he's very knowing.
It could have been done by someone in Wiltshire.
Yeah.
You know, where they never do thatch.
Seen that stuff. And I think Catherine Finley, again, when, you know, late in life, she did this swimming pool with thatch, and I remember her giving a lecture, extremely accurate discussion of the thatch and how it was a sort of 21st century thatch. There are these people who are quite comfortable to refer back into history, or to use the latest technology, or to combine it. And I think one of my irritations with very much architecture is that it sticks within a single sort of bloody O'Reilly calls his office dogma. Now, to me, you know, child of the Second World War, all the rest of it, that is very unacceptable. But for, you know, there is this thing that an architect says, we don't do that, we don't do that, we don't understand this, so we will do this. But and I keep looking at Nigel, who was the last person who would sit within that.
But I mean, I think you're right in implying that there's a sort of disciplinary centre of gravity in architecture.
Yeah, I have a slide which I didn't use here, which I have 8 gentlemen, all either German or English, all looking grim-faced. And my caption is, architecture is no laughing matter. But I have used it rather often, so I didn't think of it.
No, I think it's a good one because, of course, the person who they looked to, who was never so, well, he was dogmatic in some ways, but not in others, was Mies. You know, because Mies was the great dictator of certain sorts of form. But he wouldn't have imposed, you know, he liked other sorts of architecture. He worked with Hugo Herring, for example.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, they shared an office, and
That's even more interesting.
Mies would say, Hugo, make it bigger, because Herring was trying to get the minimal.
Well, there's an old Peter Smithson, who was my tutor in 5th year. There was a famous quote of Smithson, which is, "Mies is great, but Corb communicates," which is totally meaningless.
Yes.
But it lies with me for sort of 50 years. What does he mean? Mies is great, but Corb communicates. And it's still it's one of those stupid one-liners, and you think there's something in that. What do we mean? What do we mean? What do we mean?
Well, Peter, thank you very much for showing
My
us how we
pleasure.
can break out of these tram lines and do things that are more imaginative. I mean, I'm just thinking about Paolo Aureli, who reminds me of Hilbersheimer with a bit of colour.
Well, occasionally colour. Not a lot of colour.
Not a lot, but, you know, Hilbersheimer had none. You know, total anathema. But anyway.
So he's gone soft.
Anyway, thank you very much for this inspiring talk about certain byways and side lanes of contemporary architecture, but nonetheless very good ones. Thank you.